a lot of the work that we're doing at the World Gold Council is thinking about what can be done by society broadly, including governments, including international organizations who really have a critical role to play to help address some of these challenges, create opportunities for that gold to come into the formal gold chain, and through that, to improve these practices.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Rose Mary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land and we pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present and emerging. Gold is shining brighter than ever with a record-breaking 37 price highs this year. It is known as a secure investment in tough times. And while gold is 100% recyclable and nearly carbon neutral when in the vault, it's the mining stage of the value chain that is the most environmentally and socially fraught. Today, let's take a closer look at the ESG of gold and the work being done behind the scenes to enhance transparency and trust with Terry Heymann, CFO and ESG Lead at the World Gold Council. Welcome to the show, Terry.
Hi, Rose. Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Let's start off with a bit of a bird's-eye view. Can you tell us about the supply chain of gold?
Of course. So, as you say, gold is infinitely recyclable. Nobody ever knowingly throws away any of their gold. So, at the end of life, the end of somebody using gold for jewellery or in electronics, it gets recycled. And that's a really important part of the supply chain to gold, that constant recycling every year. About 40% of gold that comes into the supply chain is from recycled gold. And then the rest of the gold is newly mined gold. And that falls into two categories. It's either newly mined from a large-scale gold mining company, essentially a large, industrialized, well-capitalized, generally listed company, or it's from what we call artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And this is, as you would imagine from the name, individuals or small groups or collectives who are working generally with low levels of mechanization and who operate in often, unfortunately, pretty poor conditions, pretty poor environmental, pretty poor social conditions. So that large-scale gold mining, heavy, capitalized, industrial is about 40% of annual supply, and artisanal and small-scale mine, difficult to get exact numbers because so much of it is pretty informal, but that constitutes about 20% of annual supply of gold.
So let's talk about the small-scale artisanal miners and what kind of human rights issues are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, one of the things that is a challenge in the gold industry are some of the conditions around artisanal and small-scale gold mining. Now, in many other walks of life, artisanal has very positive connotations. You think of artisanal bakeries and so many things that get labeled as artisanal. But in the gold sector, artisanal, unfortunately, means people that are so often at the very edges of society that don't have alternative forms of livelihoods, that are resorting to gold mining because they don't have other things to do. There isn't land to farm or alternative ways that they can put food on the table. And one of the challenges you have is because it so often is out of the formal sector, because it exists sort of on the edge of society, and quite often it is actually illegal. The way in which this mining is done is and can very often be very poor. So we talk about human rights challenges that include often there is unfortunately child labour. There are social issues around gender, and you can often find gender-based violence or gender-based abuse occurring in and around these mine sites. And very often the environmental challenges are very poor as well. Degradation of the land, very uncontrolled degradation of that land, use of mercury to process the gold, and mercury has really, really bad impacts on human health. And these are all the issues that are associated with artisanal gold mining, again, because it exists at the edge of society. And a lot of the work that we're doing at the World Gold Council is thinking about what can be done by society broadly, including governments, including international organizations, who really have a critical role to play to help address some of these challenges, create opportunities for that gold to come into the formal gold chain, and through that to improve these practices.
And for investors, what kind of impact does this have, especially in terms of material risk?
So I think it's important at the outset to say the vast majority of investors who will be purchasing gold purchase gold that comes from an accredited refiner. Whether you buy that in the form of a physical bar, whether you buy that in the form of an ETF, that gold is almost always coming from, in Australia and in other Western markets, it's coming from what's called an LBMA accredited refiner. That means that this is a refinery that has been accredited by the LBMA, that gold meets the purity levels, but that gold also meets responsible sourcing. And that means that these refiners, and there's a list on the LBMA website of who these refiners are, 2 listed in Australia, those refiners have to follow responsible sourcing practices, what's called the responsible gold guidance. And if they don't follow that responsible gold guidance, they will be struck off the list. And that has very serious implications, because not only does it mean it's unlikely that investors will go into a gold store and buy some gold, but it's also really access to the wholesale financial markets, and the banks and the other sort of large institutions, including central banks that buy gold, will only buy gold that comes from an accredited refiner. So on the one hand, that's really important, and it means that those refiners will not take gold that is produced by these artisanal miners who really don't follow good ESG practices. On the other hand, it creates a challenge because it leaves those artisanal small-scale miners open to exploitation. They're vulnerable. There isn't a way for them to get that gold into the formal gold market, and so they are exploited by criminals, by warlords, by terrorist groups. And that's what we've been looking at recently with this report just released, World Gold Council report, where we commissioned Dominic Raab, a former Deputy Prime Minister, former Foreign Secretary and Justice Secretary in the UK. He's also originally a human rights lawyer, to look at these issues and think about what needs to be done so that these groups are encouraged to formalize or encouraged to improve their practices, and through that gain access to the formal gold market, these accredited refiners. So this is about supporting the entire system, but today there are strong safeguards in place, and we want those safeguards to remain in place, and at the same time think about how to improve standards and practices so that gold from these artisanal miners does have access to the formal gold market, because otherwise they are vulnerable to exploitation.
And you mentioned one of the research reports that has recently come out. Can you talk a bit more about what is being done to fix this?
Yeah, so this is a tricky issue. Nobody is shying away from the fact that this is a tricky challenge. So many of these artisanal miners operate in countries and in regions that themselves have poor governance, where the countries that they're operating in have governments that don't have the ability or the capacity to really manage the way in which these people are operating, that law enforcement isn't strong enough, and that the country infrastructure isn't strong enough to be able to prevent sometimes these armed gangs, terrorists operating there. Indeed, sometimes the countries are even inviting these people in. And so what the report looks at is what needs to happen to both strengthen, if you like, this institutional capacity, how to help governments in these countries have better ability to manage law enforcement and support the controlling of bad actors. Again, it's very rarely the bad actors who are actually mining the gold themselves. It's bad actors who are seeing those miners as an opportunity for easy access to financial support. But it also looks at the role of international organizations. And there are lots of international organizations that are connected into the gold market in one way or another. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has done a lot of work over the last decade and more on responsible supply chains for minerals. And the OECD has issued guidance that all companies need to follow, all companies operating in countries that are members of the OECD, including Australia, including the UK, where I'm based, and many others. And we think that the OECD could do more to continue to support a strong and robust governance system around international supply chains, but to increase the ability for those artisanal miners to get their metal into those formal supply chains, to create routes that are acceptable for formal market participants to engage. One of the challenges so often is that the refiners and the traders in the formal part of the gold market are just disincentivized from even trying to do anything because the risks are too high to them. They don't want to be associated with this gold. We've got to create mechanisms that allow them to try and do that. And in organizations like the OECD, which really, if you like, sets the global rules on international trade of minerals, can help and support that. There are other organizations that look at financial crime, and the Financial Action Task Force in particular has done a lot of work and continues to do a lot of work on designating certain places as responsible in the way that they manage these flows. And that's not so much about the places where the mining happens, but about some of the places that are intermediaries and take this gold. And there are many international centers that take this gold. One of the countries that's particularly important and we are working with to improve practices there, and I have to say there's been a great response, and we're seeing really significant improvements in the attention that they're paying to responsible sourcing, is the United Arab Emirates. They recently came off a Financial Action Task Force grey list, and that recognizes the steps that they are taking to conduct more due diligence and have more robust processes on any gold that enters the country. So that's what this report is looking at. It's looking at other international organizations that also have a role to play, including the UN Environmental Agency that thinks about mercury and the use of mercury, and says this is a really significant issue, not just for those countries where the mining happens, where there are the human rights concerns and environmental abuses that we've talked about, but also this is an issue for the globe as a whole, because unfortunately there are too many examples where that gold is linked to, for example, financing of the Wagner Group that supports terrorism in Russia, financing of Islamic State and other terrorist groups, and it really is an incumbent on the global community to engage and respond to these challenges.
Terry, thank you so much for your time today. Where can listeners find some resources to learn more about ESG and gold and the initiatives that you've mentioned today?
So we at the World Gold Council put out a lot of research into these topics. www.gold.org, or just Google or your favorite search engine, World Gold Council, and you'll find a ton of resources there linked not just to what we've discussed today around the gold supply chain and artisanal gold mining, but also importantly, the social and economic development and beneficial impact that responsible gold mining can have. And we've talked a lot today on artisanal gold mining. I want to stress the really positive role that responsible gold mining can play. We've got lots on our website about what constitutes responsible mining, about the pathway to decarbonisation and that move towards net zero, and indeed the role that gold can play as part of a climate-balanced investment portfolio. So yeah, gold.org and lots of resources there.
Until next time then, I'm Rose Mary Petrass, and thank you for listening to The Greener Way.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.